had a couple of questions that are around the topic of the FACHE credential and educational credits. Perhaps we could spend a little bit of time talking about how important continuing education is and the involvement in professional organizations and associations are to our professional development and career development, and how to go about achieving those, becoming members, getting involved, and then achieving credentials.
I'm happy to take a stab at that, Inder. HLNY is the New York chapter, as you all know, of ACHE. And the ACHE, American College of Healthcare Executives, does offer the FACHE credentialing. In healthcare, we are all about acronyms, as we all know. And participating in these types of webinars and these types of continuing educational courses allows you to further your education, continue to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in healthcare. And what we are seeing more and more in healthcare is the importance of having that credentialing of FACHE. It speaks to employers and it states that you are committed to your career, you're committed to your career path, and that you continue to keep yourself informed of how the sector is evolving. So I think that I speak for all of us on this panel, and certainly on behalf of HLNY, that we are strong advocates for your participation in ACHE, in HLNY, and for you to continue to engage in all of the types of opportunities, educational opportunities, networking opportunities that are afforded to you through participation and affiliation with the chapter.
I think also related to that, for a couple of questions that came in about achieving the credential and the steps to go about that, just to be aware that HLNY does offer events and educational sessions that help support members in that. So do stay tuned for all of you who are interested. Please make sure that you're on the mailing list and you get the messages, so that as those opportunities do come up, either remotely or perhaps in the future in person, you're able to take advantage of that through HLNY as the local chapter. So another question that's come in that I'll pose to the group is, what is the best way to manage up?
I'll start us off on that. Or you came off of mute. Did you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay. That's it's a big question, and a really important one. And it's a skill some people just innately have. I've always approached it by, everything I can do to make my manager look good and make his or her load a little easier is the first step in managing up. It's also further proves I'm capable in my role and capable of taking on more. So it's a little bit of that two-step piece. The other piece of really managing up is keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the broader setting in the industry sector. So you can speak to the broader pieces that touch on your role and things that those that are above you are actually working on every day.
Yeah, I think that the expression managing up can take on a couple of different nuances and meanings, but I do think that it's a delicate approach, and I would agree that there are some who are innately better at it, but I think that from my experience, it's trying to frame things in a standpoint about how you can create value and support the people that manage you, and being able to express that from your vantage point, and maybe a little bit lower into the weeds, might be able to be keen insight that can help them in collaborating on whatever is the actual task or the project that's at hand, or just in terms of the development of your organization and your team. That's kind of how I've approached it from my personal experience.
Excellent, thank you. So another question that came in related to shifting roles. So what would be your advice in terms of timeframes for staying in current roles before actively looking for your next step or another challenge?
I would say that you intuitively know. Trust your gut, because you will know when it is time to move on. But more specifically, once you feel that you have mastered your current role and that you feel that it is something that is becoming routine and something that you can do and it no longer challenges you, those are signals that you should perhaps start to look at other opportunities where you can continue to expand your knowledge base, continue to be challenged, and continue to contribute. For me, those are telltale signs and signals that it is time to perhaps look at other opportunities and to pursue other routes within the sector.
Yeah, I would add, if you went into a role with your 2 or 3, these are the skills I want to master in this role, you should be discussing those with your manager throughout the time in your role, and then both you and your manager will know when you're getting to the end of that, and the conversation starts to switch to what's next just naturally.
Yeah, I think that, it does get to a point where usually how I know, and I think that Regine is spot on in terms of knowing from your gut intuitively when it's actually there. A good example of that is when I sometimes find that I'm no longer being stretched and pushed in what I'm learning, and I'm more so, my feeling is that I'm just quite busy, but I'm no longer quite as much learning from it. So it's time to maybe move up or to move to a different role to get more exposure and learning. But I also think too that especially as you progress within your career, patience is definitely going to be an important virtue, and sometimes roles aren't going to open up at the same time. But trying to keep both of those in mind in terms of how you feel about what you're learning and your passion for the current role that you're in, and also what your ultimate goal is, and if being patient and waiting is going to ultimately get you there.
Great. And I think along those same lines, another question that's come in is about understanding how do you best leverage your skills to potentially shift into another area that you're not currently in. So for example, moving from a finance position into operations or strategy. And I think many of us have made those shifts, and we heard it from your introduction. So maybe Tom, you could talk a little bit more about those shifts that you made into different areas of organizations and how you looked at those skills that maybe were transferable, and also the development of new skills as you made those changes into those positions.
Sure. So I think that, a lot of my transition took place at my first institution working at Sloan Kettering. I think it's an incredible institution. And what I found though was that a lot of the roles and the departments were a little bit more centralized in terms of what your role is, especially in the earlier parts of your career. And when you move into the beginning stages of being a supervisor and a manager. And so part of it was trying to cultivate relationships in other pathways. So especially when I was still in my master's program, I was really quite interested in trying to learn as much about finance and budgeting as possible, because I did feel that from a long-term career pathway, I needed to have those skills in order to move into the roles that I had. And so it was really trying to do my due diligence to find out what those roles were, and also kind of being transparent within the interview of my lack of experience, but then also trying to use other work I've done in volunteer roles or in other service projects that spoke to my efforts to be involved in finance and budgeting. And what I learned is that I didn't want to make that exclusively what my career was all about, but I wanted to make that part of a collective skill set I would bring forward. And so it was still a valuable and rewarding experience to be in that role, and it allowed me to then step back into clinical operations. And I'm absolutely sure that I only got my break to start as the administrator at Mount Sinai because I able to have a strong background in operations, and also having that pathway and that first step into hospital finance and budgeting for a large department at Sloan Kettering allowed them to have confidence that I would have the skill sets to be able to walk in and be able to pick up and glean any further skills that were reacquired for that new role.
I would echo what Tom said, but also and what Tom said earlier tonight about really knowing the role that you're applying for. If you're going to make a big change, it's really going to be on you to link what the skills you have in your current world to how they portray in the world you want to go into. Because if it's two very different roles, the hiring manager may not know what your old role is. So there might be a slightly higher burden on you as an applicant to really make that connection. And that's something that mentors can help with, peers can help with, to how to frame that. But, it's really that piece of, linking that together. So, and Inder, in the example you said, it was finance to strategy. So maybe your finance role, you're able to take on, forecasting. Well, if you really understand a lot of strategy, it's forecasting, or at least sort of in how I think of a big piece of strategy that I rely on at Sloan Kettering is forecasting volumes. So that is a direct transfer, but do your homework on what the role is so you can clearly show that connection.
Right. And I think, you're articulating the importance of transferable skills and being able to take all of the tools that you've developed in the prior positions that we've had and be able to continue to advance those skills going forward and learn from that as you go into maybe different sectors of organizations. Particularly for early careerists looking for maybe their first or second position, some of the challenges that may be faced are in balancing the prerequisites of the roles versus the skills that can be taught on the job. And what would be your advice for early careerists looking for those positions and looking for that advancement, but maybe getting caught in some of the prerequisites that they may not have quite formally met yet, and how to balance that as they look to make those shifts in their career?
I think many of the core skills that employers are looking for candidates in positions are part of the innate skills that we have. And I think the way in which you present yourselves in your resumes is key. Remember that there are a number of aspects within your education, within your volunteerism, that really highlight and hone in on those skill sets. Don't minimize those when you are putting together your resume. Your resume is that entryway into the conversation. And once you present yourselves in a resume that is inviting, that really speaks to yourself as a complete package, and I think we had talked about that earlier this evening, that allows for that conversation to evolve during your interview. But oftentimes individuals feel that if they have not attained those skill sets in a particular professional role, then it doesn't qualify. And nothing could be further from the truth than that. When you are putting together the information that speaks to who you are as an individual, be sure to speak to what you've done on a voluntary basis. Be sure to speak to what you've done within your communities. Be sure to speak to what you've done to lead, as Tom mentioned, children within your community and coach them. All of those skills hone into how you can perform and how you can transfer those skill sets into the professional setting. So, I think it's important that you take your time and you put together a complete resume. That is one of the things that many of the students that I work with share with me to review and say, how would you review this? How would you see this from a hiring manager's perspective? And those are some of the things that I always highlight to them. And I say, you've done this, this, and this. Why isn't that represented here? And the response is usually, oh, I didn't think that I could put that on. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, you can and you should.
I think, what's important is the portrayal of your whole package, which ties in, especially as you're starting out your career, all of those skills and experiences that you have that come to the table as you start your professional career and continue to advance throughout that. And it's certainly important to include all of those other experiences that may not be directly job related, but help you develop those skills. And I think it's important to keep in mind as well that employers, so as many of us are interviewing people who are early careerists for positions that are available, there is a recognition and an understanding of the skill set that you're looking for. So looking for that balance and being able to have that open conversation and honest conversation, bringing your tangible and intangible skills to the table in a position that you're looking for. So Regine, earlier you spoke to the importance of keeping your finger on the pulse in healthcare. That struck a chord with a couple of our members, which is excellent. So there's a few questions that have come in wanting to understand a little bit more, digging a little bit deeper into how can we keep our pulse on the on healthcare? What are the best resources? Sure. What are the best avenues? And open to everybody, but I know you mentioned it, and we have at least 2 questions that came in looking for a little bit more information on how do I stay informed and what can I do to make sure that I can take that point home with me?
Sure. I'm glad that resonated with a number of our participants tonight because it is so important. And one of the key ways that you can do that is by staying connected with HLNY, staying connected with the educational courses and informational services that are provided to you through HLNY. More specifically, what you can do as an individual is to continue to get information about current events specifically in healthcare. One of the key tools that many of us in healthcare utilize is Crane's Health Pulse. It is a daily communication that comes out every morning at 6 a.m. that gives you a snapshot about what is happening in healthcare. That informs you of the most talked about, the most prominent, the most important, if you will, information that is happening here in New York in particular. There are other tools that you can utilize, modern healthcare, modern leaders of healthcare, and I'm happy to share some of this information with the HLNY board so that they can share with you and perhaps the notes of this meeting. But just getting yourselves in the communication of these publications, and most of them are free with the exception of Crane's. Most of these are free to you. You can go onto the websites, you can sign up, and you will get daily communications that come into your inbox. That is one of the easiest ways for you to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in healthcare. Staying informed is critical to how you are able to communicate about what is happening in healthcare and allow you to make informed decisions about your next move and to find out where the changes are in healthcare. One of the things that we talked about, and I know that there were some other questions about what is meant by pivoting. Healthcare is, and I'm sorry, Inder, I know we're crunched for time, but I think this is one important point that I really want to get out. Healthcare has been one of the sectors that has been slower to change in terms of moving away from our dependence on paper and our dependence on a number of antiquated, technologically advanced ways of doing business in the rest of the sector. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, healthcare was able to quickly transition from solely in-person or predominantly in-person care and the way in which care was delivered to quickly being able to shift or pivot to telehealth visits. And that is one of the prime examples of you being able to change with the environment. And so that ability for organizations to do that comes from being informed, knowing how to set that up, knowing how to reach out to your patients, knowing how to move forward that information so that individuals know what services are available, what technological support services you will need as an organization in order to do that. All of that comes from being informed, knowing best practices across the country and what are other organizations doing that are successful at this. You being able to come to the table with ideas, knowing what's happening with best practices and being able to put forward a plan to allow that transition to happen is invaluable, especially in times of crisis. So I hope that that answered two of the questions that I know were, that followed some of the things that I made mention of earlier. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you very much. I think it's so important to stay informed and know that, as you've just said, sometimes the resources will change and the current environment will drive some of these changes forward, and it may expedite them or slow some changes and information down a little bit, depending on where we are in our healthcare environment. So I think that it's extremely important, and I am very much appreciative to those folks that ask questions on how do you stay informed, because that's so critical in our roles in being able to, as you've mentioned, Regine, pivot into what we need to do organizationally, what we do to support ourselves as leaders in the organizations and our teams as well, and also executives that we work with to make those changes. And certainly COVID-19 is the most recent and a prime example of many of those changes that were required and needed to happen rapidly, and continued with focus and an understanding of what may or may not change or continue to change in the near and medium term. And as we continue to live through that availability to connect internally and network and stay informed ourselves with looking at what's changing in the environment, but also connecting with our colleagues and our network of communication professional, friends, and as I said, the network. It's extremely important as we all are going through these changes in our own organizations and trying to do what's best to care for our communities at this time of need and ultimately in the future. So I think with that, we are actually out of time. I apologize there were a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but we appreciate all of that, and we certainly can try and answer them individually as we have them. But with that, I will pass off to Sam Lin for some closing remarks.
All right, thank you, Inder.
Thank you.
So, good evening. My name is Sam Lin. I am President-elect for HLNY. We are glad you have come and hope that you have found today's program valuable. I certainly have. I want to thank Inder for moderating today's program and driving the discussions and taking us through the journey of the career development of each of our panelists. You did a great job. And Regine, how you shared some of the interactions you had, how some of the interactions you had earlier in your career with a patient impacted and motivated, and as well as inspired you in the healthcare industry. Mindy and Tom, how you were able to weather the economic downturns and changing landscape by pivoting and finding new opportunities. I also remember, Tom, when you were sharing about getting out of your comfort zone and just being vulnerable. And along the same lines, Regine, you mentioned about strengthening your skill sets by identifying areas of opportunities, identifying areas for improvements, and finding opportunities like Toastmasters. That was quite creative. Mindy, you shared about don't get discouraged and stay the course as healthcare roles are changing, and the importance of trying to be nimble. I hear that so much now where people are getting discouraged and finding jobs, but we want to encourage you all to continue that course, be strong, be knowledgeable, stay up to date with what's in the industry, and continue to sharpen your skills as you develop your career, develop in your career journey. So your collective stories really serve as an inspiration for career development and growth, and I want to thank you. I would like to acknowledge the support of our sponsors who made this panel discussion possible. Please visit our website, HLNY.org, to see our upcoming programs and how you can connect with us. For anybody on this webinar who are students, I encourage you to take a look at the Student Services section, as we are now accepting scholarship applications at this time. So thank you again for joining us tonight, and hope to see you at future events. Have a good evening.